Joining us now is Rubino. He's a political analyst and historian. Rich, good morning. Thank you for being with us.
Good morning.
You know, the U.S. is towing this line of supporting Israel amid concerns over the civilian toll in Gaza. This week, we've seen more protests of the war across the country. President Biden himself has urged Israel to be, quote, more careful, while officials are talking to Israelis about potential transitions to lower intensity, more surgical focuses. But the administration is very steadfast in its support for Israel. So my question for you is, how long can the U.S. maintain that position? And what do you think are the factors, if anything, that could sway the stance here?
Yes, well, I think part of it, and you have to look at, and you have to separate the U.S. from Joe Biden specifically. And for Joe Biden has been an ardent supporter, certainly of Israel, but also of Netanyahu. And he's one of the few, the United States is one of the few countries at the United Nations General Assembly who is opposed to the idea of a ceasefire. And this tends to be hurting him politically, at least in the United States. Many Arab Americans, for example, in places like Dearborn, Michigan, are saying that they would not come out and vote for Joe Biden or Donald Trump in 2024. Michigan is obviously a very, very critical swing state. You're seeing Biden's rhetoric, though, start to shift from originally when it was essentially supporting Netanyahu. Now, essentially saying that in essence, that President Netanyahu needs to be careful. That he needs to stop indiscriminate bombing, needs to have more surgical strikes, for example. So you're starting to see that shift in President Biden's rhetoric. And also you see the other thing you see in terms of President Biden is very many young voters. So they're becoming very disaffected with the process. And one of Biden's biggest fears is many of those young voters will either stay home or potentially vote for Cornel West or Jill Stein in the general election.
You know, we see Israel increasingly losing global support for this war. Biden himself, when he talked about that indiscriminate bombing, shared concerns over just that. So what are the potential consequences when we look globally for the United States? Because it is very firm that it still supports Israel, citing the threat from Hamas, officials calling it a, quote, genocidal threat just this week.
Yes, but you have to also separate Israel from Netanyahu and the Likud party. There are multiple parties in the Israeli political system. There were 39 parties, for example, that actually ran candidates for the Knesset in the 2022 legislative elections. And Bibi Netanyahu is extremely unpopular in the country of Israel. His job approval rating is hovering about 30%. It's actually lower than Joe Biden's is in the United States right now. You have to separate that. There are different voices in Israel. Israel is very much multifarious in terms of political parties, in terms of rhetoric, in terms of voices, in terms of views on Israel. To many who support a ceasefire, for example, there are polls showing majority support a ceasefire. So you have to separate that, and you also have to, in some respects, separate the United States support from Israel with the support of Netanyahu, with the support of Israel.
And when we look at that data, again, you're mentioning, according to December data for Progress poll, more than 60% of likely U.S. voters support a ceasefire in Gaza. Again, the administration does not support a general ceasefire, but recent polling has shown, as you mentioned, some divisions, especially among Democrats, over the approval of the administration's handling. So going into an election year here, how much do you see the support swaying voters?
Yes, it's very important because only about 11% of the U.S. politicians actually support a ceasefire, yet upwards of 66% you see in some polls of the American population is supporting a ceasefire. So it's a disconnect between the Americans and their elected officials. In terms of President Biden, he's actually, I think, in a very similar position, say, President Johnson was during Vietnam. In the President Johnson and many older Democrats supported the prosecution of the Vietnam War. But then you had an uprising among young voters. Eventually, in 1968, Eugene McCarthy won about 42% in the New Hampshire primary, and President Johnson had to drop out. Very eerie similitudes with Joe Biden. You have many older Democrats, many Jewish Democrats, many more conservative Democrats who say, yes, we support the continuing campaign in Gaza, while many younger voters and many Arab and American voters who are very crucial in places like Michigan and Arizona specifically, and to a certain degree Georgia, these crucial swing states, who become very disaffected with the Democratic Party, very disaffected with the Biden administration. And the worst nightmare is they stay home or they vote for Cornel West, or potentially in a primary, someone like Marianne Williamson does exceedingly well. Not that she beat Joe Biden, but that it could potentially be an embarrassment for the president.
All right, Rich Rubino, thank you for your insight this morning. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.